Irish Studies seminar, which we're running jointly with the Centre for 18th Century Studies here in Queen's. Great to see so many 18th Century Studies people here as well. Fantastic turnout. We've got an audience joining us online through Teams as well, so welcome to you. Great pleasure for me to welcome to Queen's Catriona Kennedy. Catriona is a reader in modern British and Irish history at the University of York, specialist in the long 18th century, with particular emphasis on gender, radicalism, confessional relations, and warfare. The previous publications include narratives of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, military and civilian experience in Britain and Ireland, 1793 to 1815, and a co-edited book, Soldiering in Britain and Ireland, 1750 to 1850, Men of Arms. And she's working on her third monograph at the moment, which will be on master and servant in 18th century Ireland. But before we get there, we have to talk about why we're here today, which is to celebrate the publication of Catriona's monograph, Women, Politics and the Irish Public Sphere in the Age of Revolution. Catriona's going to talk to us about the main themes of the book and what it brings to an understanding of Ireland in the late 18th century and the turn of the beginning of the 19th century, and the place of women within that. So without further ado, Catriona, can I invite you to come up and speak to us on that subject?
Thank you so much, Peter, for the very generous introduction and for the invitation to come to Belfast. It's always a delight to be here, and thank you so many of you for coming out this evening. So, in Claire Mitchell's 2022 book, The Ghost Limb, which explores the meaning and legacy of 1798 in the north of Ireland, she writes, "When I think of 1798, I feel waves of testosterone wash over me. All those stories of vivid drunken nights, making resolutions, swearing oaths. I want to go to the pub in the 1790s and make resolutions too. But I'm unsure if a woman is allowed to go to the pub, and I'm not sure who'll mind my kids." So Mitchell asks some really important questions here. Where might women fit into the scenes of hard drinking, masculine sociability that we know were so important to radical politics in this period? What did the age of revolution mean for Irish women? And one of my aims in writing the book was, in some sense, to try and penetrate that fog of testosterone that still enshrouds this period, and to address some of these questions. And admittedly, this isn't a straightforward task. One of the dominant themes of Irish politics in the last quarter of the 18th century is militarisation. So running from the armed volunteers of the Protestant Patriot campaigns of the 1770s and 80s, to the revolutionary underground of the United Irishmen, to the pipe-wielding rebels of 1798. And the very title, of course, of the Republican movement, the United Irishmen, and the constant invocations of brotherhood in Republican rhetoric seem to speak to its emphatically masculinist ethos. And the deeply gendered character of Irish patriots and kind of radical politics is, to some degree, might be illustrated by the image on the cover of the book. This is from 1786, and it shows an Irish volunteer taking liberty under his protection. So it appears to emblematise the kind of muscular martial values promoted by the classical republicanism that informed both the volunteers and the United Irishmen. So it often centred on the figure of the citizen soldier and tended to relegate women to a more passive supporting role. And you can kind of see that perhaps in these hyper-feminine female figures on the right of the image. But of course, militarisation is only one half of the story of radical and reformist politics in this period. Another way of narrating those developments is to emphasise the increasing density of the public sphere. So the expansion of the press, print culture, and a reading public, as well as the evolution of an increasingly sophisticated associational culture. So together, these developments, according to Jürgen Habermas and many others since, provided the infrastructure for and the kind of habits of thought for democratic challenges to the state in the late 18th century. And when feminist historians of the French Revolution began interrogating whether the democratic public sphere was contingently or essentially masculinist, so was it not just constructed without women, but actually against women, where they stood on that question tended to depend on whether they adopted a kind of classical republican model of the public sphere or a more Habermasian understanding of the public sphere. So the latter tended to emphasize that while women were by no means full and equal actors in the public sphere, they had sufficient access to enable a sense of themselves as political actors and participants in the formation of public opinion. So I tended to adopt that more optimistic interpretation of the expanding Enlightenment public sphere and the possibilities that it afforded to women. One of the objectives of the United Irishmen was, in the words of Thomas Addis Emmet, quote, to make every man a politician. And we now know a great deal about the innovative techniques that the United Irishmen developed to reach and politicise new audiences. So another question I pursue in the book is how far women were also included in that project of literary enfranchisement. And there's lots of evidence that women did respond to the more direct, accessible language of the radical press, that they were avid readers of the Northern Star newspaper and its successor, the Press. But at the same time, I was also mindful of the feminist scholar Anne McClintock's observation that analyses of revolutionary moments have often assumed that women, quote, learn their politics only at men's invitation. So the implication being that they cannot have an independent pathway to political consciousness or a distinctive response to a revolutionary programme. And that tendency to present women's politics in this period as almost entirely mediated through their relationships with men would be evident in the earliest nationalist hagiographies of the United Irishmen, which tended to cast the women associated with them in the role of supportive mothers, steadfast wives, or weeping widows. And that would continue into the 20th century with works like the nationalist historian Helena Concannon's 1919 Women of 98. And you can see the chapter headings here, the mothers of 98, the wives of 98, the sisters, so the women themselves aren't even named. It tends to be the wife of Theobald Wolfe-Tone and so on. And as Concannon would write in her chapter on Lady Lucy Fitzgerald, the sister of the United Irishman, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, she would comment that Lady Lucy loved the cause because Edward loved it, whom she loved above all things. So in the century that followed Concannon's history, of course, there were efforts to approach women associated with Irish radicalism as figures in their own right. And we can think here particularly of Mary McNeill's pioneering 1960 biography of Mary Ann McCracken. But I think there remained a kind of stubborn tendency to present women as satellites of their male relatives' ideological planets. And I wanted to see if we could move beyond that by looking more closely at female-centred spaces, women's friendships, and initiatives that shaped women's responses to the political contests of the 1790s, and the distinctive preoccupations that women brought to bear on those contests. And in doing that, I wondered if it would be possible to offer a slightly different interpretation of this image. So rather than seeing the volunteer stretching out his arm and inviting women into the revolutionary moment, could we focus instead on this circle of women conversing with each other, engaging with each other, and holding the cap of liberty, you know, for themselves? So I, wanted to try and think about both that image, but more broadly, the politics of the period from a slightly different angle. And that approach involved focusing on a slightly different cast of characters to those who had been traditionally assembled under the heading The Women of 98, and also interrogating that category, the Women of 98, which tended to elide the way that rank and religion shaped the outlooks and spheres of action available to different groups of women. So another aim of the book was to try and reconstruct the distinctively gendered political cultures of Ireland's principal communities and to ask how those shaped the meanings of the 1790s for women. So Theobald Wolfe famously declared that the French Revolution, quote, changed in an instant the politics of Ireland. The revolution became the test of every man's political creed and divided the nation into two great parties: aristocrats, those who opposed the revolution, and the Democrats who supported it. And in what follows, I'd like to think about, you know, this description, what Tone was describing, probably overstating, was a dramatic transformation of the Irish political landscape. And what I'd like to do is just to track some of the ways in which women navigated and that transformed landscape and that new vocabulary, just by introducing some of the case studies that I look at in the book. And the first of these is Elizabeth Rawdon, Countess of Moira. So she was born in England, but married her Irish husband, Sir John Rawdon, in 1752. He would later become Earl of Moira. And she would spend the remaining 6 decades of her life in Ireland, becoming a celebrated antiquarian, patron, philanthropist, hostess. In the words of Thomas Moore, the poet, she was, quote, a great friend of Ireland. And in 1792, Theobald Wolfe friend and patron, Colonel Henry Barry, arranged an introduction for Tone to Lady Moira. So Lady Moira's son was then being mooted as a possible Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So the United Irishmen were keen to try and persuade him to advocate for the United Irishmen's interests. So Barry urged Tone to listen seriously to Lady Moira's opinions, noting that he had, quote, on all occasions found them to be the best I could adopt. And I'll just say here, Lady Moira was not short of opinions, nor hesitant in supplying them. Following this introduction, Lady Moira invited Tone and his fellow United Irishmen, Thomas Russell and William Todd Jones, to dine at Moira House in Dublin. And in her letter of invitation, she stressed her willingness to listen to novel political perspectives. And she explained her belief that exposure to a variety of views helped to stave off, quote, that precise obstinacy too apt to infect advanced life. So she was in her early 60s by this stage, and suggesting, that it would be good to shake herself out of maybe a certain rut. But she continued, if they hoped to convert her to the revolutionary cause, they had to prepare to be disappointed. Quote, as for making a Democrat of me, that, you must be persuaded, is a fruitless hope. For to keep my Manche and Clarence arms, it is more probable I should turn Amazon. and having the blood of Hugh Capet in my veins, I am from nature a firm aristocrat. So Lady Moira was, as she acknowledged herself, a terrible snob, but she took immense pride in her own very distinguished lineage. And here she brandished her descent from Hugh Capet, King of the Franks, founder of the Capetian dynasty, from whom the soon-to-be executed King Louis XVI could also trace his descent. So what insights into elite Protestant women's relationship with Irish radicalism might we be able to draw from this encounter and Lady Moira's imperious response? Well, firstly, I think it encourages to look beyond the exclusively masculine spaces of political sociability, the pub, the club, the Masonic lodge, the corps, to recognise the many sites in which women's contributions as enlightened conversationalists, political actors and cultural producers were recognised by the United Irishmen. So the late 18th century salon Lady Moira hosted at Moira House. You can see here, this is it in the 19th century when it had been kind of reconfigured. But she was famously hosted a salon at Moira House that entertained various distinguished literary and politically Whiggish figures, including a number of United Irishmen. So the Belfast radical William Sanson was a regular attendee, and he would, in his memoir, recall his visits to Moira House and pay tribute to Lady Moira as a, quote, lady distinguished by advantages greater than her high birth, those of a cultivated and solid mind, stored with the richest treasures of erudition. And if we look further as well, we can see other examples of this. So the writer Alicia Sheridan Lefanu was also at the centre of a Dublin literary and political coterie, which included the United Irishman Valentine Lawless and William James McNevin. And in the book, I also point to Lady Moira's particular skill in cultivating an intellectual milieu that was hospitable to women, and her support for women writers like Charlotte Brooke, the antiquarian scholar, the poet Mary Tighe, and Maria Edgeworth. So in her 1814 novel, Patronage, Edgeworth includes a kind of thinly fictionalised version of Lady Moira and uses that to praise what she saw as Lady Moira's particular skill as a hostess and her insistence on, quote, mingling feminine and masculine subjects of conversation instead of dooming one sex to politics, argument and eternal sense, the other to scandal, dress and eternal nonsense. So she's, this kind of particular aptitude she had, or desire to ensure these quite intellectual spaces of mixed sex sociability was something particularly singled out by Edgeworth. In acting as a political intermediary between the United Irishmen and her son, Lady Moira, of course, also highlighted the informal political influence elite women often exercised, and which Mary O'Dowd, of course, has done so much to kind of highlight for Ireland. Lady Moira's husband, it was widely agreed, was not particularly intellectually or politically gifted. So it was widely understood that Lady Moira was responsible for encouraging him to play a larger role in political and patriotic life. And she exerted further influence through her son-in-law, the Earl of Granard. So she assumed management of his estates and his political interests when he and his wife went on the Grand Tour in the 1780s. And you can see that recognition of this quite formal political influence in a way in briefing notes that were prepared for the Lord Lieutenant, the Duke of Rutland in 1784, where they were questioning whether the MP from Mullingar would be prepared to act in the interests of Dublin Castle. And the notes say, we don't know whether he will be, because he is completely under the control of Lady Moira, and some doubts are entertained of her favourable turn. But of course, it was precisely those aspects of Georgian politics that granted women a degree of influence: its informal and familial character, the tendency to treat political power as a form of heritable property, that radical reformers identified as symptomatic of the corruption and banality of the unreformed political system. And in France and Britain, those kind of critiques of aristocratic women's illegitimate political influence often veered into really vicious, often pornographic, misogynistic attacks. And for various reasons, perhaps to do with the kind of intimacy of the ascendancy world in Ireland, radical rhetoric was much less hostile towards elite women. But the United Irishmen did highlight what they saw as the absurdities of the Irish constitution that allowed women to own and control parliamentary boroughs. So in a 1792 editorial entitled "The Rights of Women," the Northern Star newspaper, alluding to the debates on citizenship that had accompanied the first French constitution in 1791, observed, quote, that it was thought a very wild scheme of some French writers who proposed that women should be admitted to the elective franchise. But the Constitution of Ireland goes much further, for it allows women not merely to vote for, but to nominate legislators. And then it named a number of women who did have direct control of particular boroughs. And I think that in light of these sort of attacks on elite women's influence, Lady Moira's assertion that she would rather turn Amazon than Democrat is telling. So she's reframing the ideological divisions of the 1790s as a contest between a powerful figure of martial femininity and the forces of democracy. And I think this might suggest a sharpened consciousness of the gendered implications of the rights of man for women like her, an awareness that any programme of democratic reform would likely exclude women much more definitively than a system in which property and inheritance conferred political privileges on both sexes. While Lady Moira may have rebuffed United Irish efforts to make a Democrat of her, she was equally reluctant to identify with the counter-revolutionary position now connoted by the term aristocrat. As she later put it, she was, quote, an aristocrat of the genuine breed. And her political outlook through the 1790s continued to be guided by political principles that I think, in terms of 18th century politics, we might say were by country ideology. So this is a kind of ideology that stressed the independence of great landed proprietors, their role as impartial supervisors of government, and the obligations that bound together landed elites and their dependents. As she wrote to the old family friend and United Irishman William Todd Jones in 1797, quote, "I love the people and thought it my duty to protect and serve them. I should not, nor do I choose, to be tyrannised by the mob, having never had the least inclination to practice tyranny over those who are subject to my influence." And that sense of a duty to protect and serve her tenantry would be evident in her response to acts of government brutality on the Moira estate at Montalto in County Down. So in July 1797, following General Lake's brutal campaign of pacification in Ulster, Lady Moira collected accounts of government brutality, which she then sent to the Lord Lieutenant, the Earl of Camden. And during the 1798 rebellion, Henry Monroe and the rebel army set up a kind of ad hoc camp on the Moira estate at Montalto. And as government troops closed in on the rebels, they began burning the houses and villages surrounding the camp. And in the aftermath, Lady Moira would attend to those who had suffered during this period. She sent an apothecary to treat those who'd been injured. She financed the rebuilding of a number of houses. And perhaps because of these actions, she was fondly remembered in a 19th century ballad commemorating Henry Monroe and the Battle of Ballinhinch, which declared, quote, "Here's a health to Lady Moira and long may she reign. We fought our last battle, all in her domain." So we can see that Lady Moira, while sceptical of democratic reform, was equally critical of the forces of counter-revolutionary reaction. And that way, the power and confidence she derived from her status and influence seems to have allowed her to transcend the polarities of aristocrat and democrat. But in the book, I explore a number of other women who were in Lady Moira's circle, who found the new politics, I suppose radical politics grounded in rational individual judgment, much more compelling, but for whom that generated a lot more tension between their kind of loyalty to their family and to their rank and the kind of attractions of a politics based as they saw it on enlightened reason and judgment. So the next example I'd like to consider is even closer to home, is from 1790s Belfast, and it's a letter written by the Belfast Presbyterian Martha McTeer to her brother, the founding member of the United Irishmen, William Drennan, in December 1794. So the previous year, McTeer had been elected secretary to a newly established charity, the Humane Female Society for the Relief of Lying-in Women, which had become Belfast's first maternity hospital. And in terms of the history of British and Irish philanthropy, this really was a very pioneering initiative. So it was one of the few charities to be established by women of the middling classes, and it was also one of the very few charities to be entirely governed and organised by women. So in this letter from 1794, McTeer is reporting to her brother on the final meeting of the charity's first year, and she couched it in the language of a parliamentary report. She described the address from the society's president, a series of votes on various issues, which she said had been carried unanimously. But then she went on to observe that beneath the appearance of unanimity, she saw a party forming under the pretext of keeping out unmarried women, which she believed was an attempt to raise opposition against those, quote, who are now deemed Democrats. So McTeer was clearly hoping to entertain her brother with this account of the charity's business. But her framing of the factional splits in the female society in terms of the struggle between aristocrats and democrats suggests how this kind of revolutionary vocabulary had seeped into even these kind of parochial disputes. And the term by women to philanthropic work is sometimes interpreted as a retreat from politics. But one of the arguments I wanted to make in the book was that McTeer's charitable work had a kind of intellectual and political rationale. And in particular, I argue that it was connected with her increasing anxiety about the fragility of civil society as it buckled under ideological pressures. So the McTeer's husband and brother were both members of the United Irishmen, and she herself was an enthusiastic supporter of Republican principles. throughout the 1790s, she would insist that she was not merely an echo, as she put it, of her male relatives. So she and her brother differed over the course of the French Revolution, over the execution of the French king and queen, and she was also profoundly troubled by the increasing violence of Irish radical politics. So McTeer's letters, so brilliantly edited by Jean Agnew, provide a vivid chronicle of Belfast's burgeoning public sphere, in which McTeer was an active, enthusiastic participant. So she was a member of the Belfast Reading Society, which being set up as a kind of forum for education and political discussion by radical artisans. In the early 1790s, she would attend the increasingly tense town meetings that were often held in the First Presbyterian Church, where Belfast citizens were debating issues like whether or not to press for full and immediate Catholic emancipation. She was also a regular guest at Belfast Assembly Rooms, which you can see at the top row, which is the town's preeminent site of mixed-sex sociability. And in her letters, McTeer kind of charts and laments the fragmentation of Belfast's formerly very coherent civil society, as former friends and allies became implacable enemies, and as violent confrontation seemed increasingly inevitable. And while McTeer remained sympathetic to the United Irish cause and continued to move in United Irish circles, she also conceived of herself as a political moderator and someone who could work across partisan divisions. And that sense of herself as a political moderator is, I think, also evident in her charitable work. So both of the Lying In Hospital, but also the Union School, which would be Belfast's first free school, and she was involved with that from 1795. So McTeer clearly understood in some ways that philanthropic work could align with the United Irish aim of widespread, democratic literary enfranchisement. So acknowledging how much newspapers, how important they'd been in her own political education. She proposed at one point opening a free newspaper room for the poor, where they would provide a fire and candles. She never did that, but she was clearly thinking about this. And she also had her own sort of small school where she would pick up poor girls from the town and educate them at home. But as she made clear, she did not teach her girls to, quote, gabble over the Testament only. She was teaching them how to read through the newspapers by getting them to read political speeches. But significantly, in the more formal kind of philanthropic organisations that she was involved in, they brought together women of different Protestant denominations and of different kind of ideological positions. So it brought together both radical and loyalist women. So the president of both societies, with whom McTeer worked closely, was the religious evangelical Lady Harriet Skeffington, whose husband, Chichester Skeffington, was the Sheriff of Antrim in the 1790s. And he would be responsible for the arrest, trial and execution of William Orde, who would become the United Irishmen's first martyr. But in a relationship with Skeffington, so, Skeffington was an unlikely friend for the sister of the founding, one of the founders of the United Irishmen to have. But it's clear that in her relationship with Skeffington, she was trying to kind of model this respectful dialogue across partisan divisions that was proving increasingly elusive to Belfast's male citizens at the time. So, for instance, she and Harriet Skeffington would exchange reading material from different sides of the political divide. So Skeffington would send McTeer sort of loyalist accounts of the depredations committed by French revolutionary troops in Europe. And then McTeer would send Skeffington some articles from the United Irish paper, The Press. And I think we can see in this commitment to working across the ideological divide an effort to salvage the institutions and practices of the enlightened public sphere from the damage wrought by civil conflict. And there have been a number of very illuminating analyses or histories published in the last decade or so, tracing how Belfast's radicals recovered a sense of civic identity and purpose after 1798 by kind of channeling their progressive politics into charitable, educational and literary initiatives. So things like the Belfast Academical Institute. But I suppose one of the arguments I wanted to make was actually women in the 1790s in Belfast are already doing this, and they're really preparing the ground for that work that happens in the early 19th century, which is largely led by men. So the final example I'd like to consider is a report by McTeer's brother, William Drennan, who was then living in Dublin, on his dealings with the wealthy Catholic silk merchant and United Irishman, John Keogh. So Keogh's wife, Drennan observed, though, quote, a good woman, was highly bigoted. The women of the Catholic elite as a whole were, he opined, quote, the most rancorous aristocrats, more concerned with supporting the emigrant priests who had fled the French Revolution than with supporting republicanism at home. So we should take this, of course, with a pinch of salt. Drennan was a partial and prejudiced observer of Catholic circles. He believed that his own efforts on behalf of the Catholics hadn't been sufficiently recognised. So, you know, that may be informing what he says here. But it's a really rare and unusual commentary on the political outlook and attitudes of the women associated with this newly asserted Catholic leadership in the 1790s. So in researching the book, I was very conscious of not wanting to write a book that focused exclusively on Protestant women. But there is a challenge in that we just don't have the sort of rich collections like the McTeer Drennan correspondence or the kind of family papers of Protestant landed families. There just aren't any equivalents, I think, or few for the kind of propertied, more affluent Catholic families. But from what I've been able to piece together, it would seem that property Catholic women, even those whose male relatives were engaged in radical politics, did tend to reject republicanism and support the Catholic hierarchy's struggle in what they termed the French disease. So, for example, if we look at the subscription list of the Dublin Augustinian William Gahan's Youth Instructed in the Grounds of the Christian Religion, with remarks in the writings of Voltaire, Rousseau and Thomas Paine. So this is the kind of classic counter-Enlightenment text published on the eve of the 1798 rebellion. But you know, if you go through the full subscription list, about 30% of the subscribers are women, and presumably Catholic women, and you can see some just from a sample page there. Of course, wealthy Catholic women's detachment from the ideology and practice of republicanism didn't necessarily mean an uncritical attitude towards Irish misgovernment. And I'll just briefly illustrate this with reference to one of the few Catholic women for whom there is a reasonably substantial archive of correspondence from the 1790s, and whose life and career can provide some insight into how educated, more affluent Catholic women negotiated the penal laws and responded to the era's revolutionary challenges. So this is Barbara Verschoyle, and you can see here a plaque erected in her memory in Booterstown Church, the suburb of Dublin, and also the lodge in Mount Merion, where she lived intermittently from 1793. And on a personal side note, this used to be a youth club. This is where I went to kind of childhood discos, but it's in a much more dilapidated stage now. So Verschoyle was for several decades, from the 1780s, the agent for Richard Fitzwilliam, the 7th Viscount Fitzwilliam of Mount Merion, which is really remarkable given that she was Catholic and a woman. But there's some suggestion that though the 6th Viscount Fitzwilliam of Merion converted, that the family kind of retained Catholic sympathies through the 18th century. And the Fitzwilliams, of course, were responsible for constructing much of what we consider today to be classic Georgian Dublin, Merrion Square, the suburbs of Booterstown and Blackrock. And Verschoyle was absolutely central to overseeing those projects. And as agent for the Fitzwilliam, Verschoyle was able to kind of oversee a very subtle incremental Catholicisation of public space in Dublin by the late 18th century. So she successfully lobbied Fitzwilliam to build this Catholic chapel in Booterstown that this plaque commemorates. And in the years leading up to the rebellion, Verschoyle provided regular reports to Fitzwilliam on the deteriorating economic and political situation in Ireland. And she urged him to address this by reducing or freezing his rents, and offered very trenchant commentaries on what she saw as the failure to provide for the poor at a moment of severe economic crisis, a failure which she saw as driving the country to rebellion. And she demanded of Fitzwilliam, quote, "How can this country be quiet where so many thousands are unemployed, where so many millions are starving?" So Verschoyle demonstrated a keen sympathy with the plight of the Catholic poor, but she was always quick to stress her political loyalty. And in that respect, she seems to have shared the outlook of Catholic women of a similar class and their hostility to the French Revolution. And one of the reasons for that hostility, I suggest or speculate, may be traced to these women's personal and kind of imaginative ties with the plight of convents in continental Europe, where some of them would have been educated. So their perception of the French Revolution was likely profoundly coloured by the lurid stories that were emerging from Europe of the forced closure of religious orders, the public beating of nuns in Paris, the French troops rampaging through convents in southern Germany and the Low Countries. And I suggest that there is a kind of split in the I suppose, ideological tracks on which Catholic men and women of this class are running through the 1790s. You know, at this moment, men are focused on securing political rights and power. Women are focused on the restoration and expansion of the faith. You know, Irish Catholic women were engaged in a revolution, but it was an incipient devotional revolution rather than a republican revolution. And of course, we can see that in the work of figures like Nana Nagle, the founder of the Presentation Order, and her collaborator, the Catholic philanthropist Teresa Mullally. And in the 1790s, their work was being presented by the Catholic hierarchy to the Vatican as an important front in the war against revolutionary infidelity. You know, so there's increasingly urgent letters from figures like Francis Moylan, the Bishop of Cork, saying, you know, you must, to shore up the Catholic faith in Ireland, you must allow these women to establish these convents and educate. the people in the faith. And that sense of Catholic mission would also be evident in Barbara Fishoyle's charitable work. So she ends up, clearly becomes very wealthy, and she ends up endowing a small school in Dublin that is overseen by Mary Aikenhead and the Sisters of Mercy in the early 19th century. I don't have time. Maybe rather, I can say more. I do also talk about the women of no property, but if you are interested in that, I am happy to expand on it in questions. But I hope I've been able to give you some flavour of the issues covered in the book. So my aim really has been to try and trace the intellectual, political, religious investments that women brought to bear and the challenges of the 1790s. And I suppose for the women I consider, as well as for many men, those polarities, those categories of aristocrat and democrat, couldn't really capture the complexity of their political positions. But I think the revolutionary moment did demand careful deliberation on what those contexts meant, whether that meant a sceptical reading of the implications of republicanism for elite women, or the infusion of philanthropic and evangelical work with political and ideological import. So I hope that kind of helps us to question in some small way what it means to be revolutionary, and to ask what revolution might look like when viewed from the perspective of women. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's fascinating material, and you've given us a real insight into some of the key stories that you're investigating in the book. I'm sure there will be questions from people in the room, people online. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand electronically, and Becca will let us know that you're waiting to become involved. But let's start with the room. Who would like to open up the Q&A? Yes.
I come from French, right? Many years ago, I read many local newspapers like Belfast Newsletter and all the stuff. And I was very struck by then about readers having a sense that the times were changing. I was very struck by it. I was surprised, as it were, seeing your periphery and not obviously evidently in terms of French Revolution. I just wondered whether some of the women you research on sort of reacted to things like that, read newspapers or even periodicals for that.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's one of the things that I was looking at, is that sense, and especially the new types of newspapers. I think, the Northern Star, the Press, because they do have this much more accessible style. There aren't the kind of dense classical allusions that earlier forms of political writing have. So there are lots of examples of women saying, actually, I hadn't really thought much about politics until I read the Press, or read one of these radical papers. So I think that sense of as you say, that's the sense of the French Revolution as it's often thought about as speeding up time. This is one of the kind of ways that that's accelerate, because so many things that seemed impossible are happening nearly every day. And one of the things I was interested in actually was particularly thinking about the kind of women that come to the fore at this moment. And so even in Belfast, they're thinking about Madame Roland, who, is one of the key kind of intellectual women associated with the Girondins, and Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, writing defences of the French Revolution. And having those kind of intellectual political women just suddenly available, I think really expands the sense of what's possible as a woman, or the kind of, there's just seems to be more of those kind of figures emerging in this period.
Maura?
Thank you so much. That was really, really, really interesting. So my question is really about, I suppose, thinking about, do these women have a conception of themselves, as constituting because sisterhood is too broad a word, but given that she said the language of brotherhood, fraternity is very, very prevalent in the 1790s, and I'm wondering about women to women kind of networks and so on. And I know that I think it's in Marianne McCracken's correspondence, there's this reference to that. Is it like female societies?
Yes.
And there's always been a lot of, I think, debate about that and stories being differently. And I wondered if there was anything in your research that you unearthed that might explain to us whether she meant female societies in the sense of a very loose sense of female friends, you know, or whether there was a kind of more organised element to women's involvement.
Well, obviously, what you know, and I think your work on the language of sisterhood, I kind of thought, you know, was thinking about a lot. And I mean, I wouldn't say there's an explicit parallel, but interestingly, when McTeer asks William Drennan if he'll write a piece to promote the work of the Union School, he describes it. He talks about this is what female patriotism looks like and calls it a sisterhood. And then she responds to the draft and says, I like the idea of the sisterhood, but it may bring to mind, it may sound too close to the Brotherhood of the United Irishmen, and possibly that's too political language. So I think it doesn't end up in the final draft or the final version that's published in the Belfast newsletter. But yeah, I wasn't able to maybe illustrate that quite as effectively, but I mean, I'm really interested in that sense of women's circles and the relationships that they're having with each other. So, you know, with McTeer as well, as I say, there's a network of, you know, she does see herself as part of this broader female network of women who are involved in educational and philanthropic work, that are, you know, interested in the work of Dougal Stewart. So there is this sense of a kind of sense of affinity with these broader circles of women, and you know, and also the importance of, I think, women's friendships to their radicalisation in certain instances. So yeah, I wish I could have tracked a more kind of explicit framing of that as a sisterhood. And the female societies, I've spent like years trying to figure out what they are, and I don't know whether, yeah, I'm no closer. I think they're most likely to have been just a loose grouping that was raising funds for the United Irishmen that had been imprisoned. And that, I don't think there's, that's as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that paper. And I'm struck by the images of the architectural images of spaces where women would gather in public spaces, and one of those was the First Presbyterian Church. And visiting that church, I was struck certainly by the US sort of colonial figures there, and of course there's a statue there of Hamilton, who translated Hedaya, and Elizabeth Hamilton is his sister, you know. So she's writing in the 1790s, I think, letters to a Hindu grandmother, and so on. And these connections with you know, the colonies just seem interesting. I'm just wondering whether those kinds of, you know, connections, discussions are coming into this kind of discourse, because, you know, again, the United Irishmen are also connected with India in various ways, and so on and so forth. So I just wondered if it was coming into this discourse at all.
It's a really interesting question. And of course, you know, and Elizabeth Hamilton does come back to, you know, is visiting Belfast in the 1790s, and, you know, visits. Martha McTeer has these reading parties that Elizabeth Hamilton comes to. Is it? I'm trying to think. I don't want to say give a definitive question, because it may be I just wasn't thinking hard enough about it to, or looking for, in this particular project, those colonial connections. But it is, I mean, I'm certainly looking for more on anti-slavery rhetoric in the McTeer-Drennan correspondence, you know, and they both are, critics of slavery, but it actually isn't as evident there as you would think it might be. It's similarly not that evident in Mary Ann McCracken's letters from this period, even though she does go on to be such an advocate. But that's a really good question, and I'm afraid I need to think about it. I don't have a ready answer. Yeah.
I know Mary has to go, so I'm going to be Mary first and then Leona.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed your book very much, so I would recommend it to other people to read about. The quote you had from, I don't know who it was, about we have women who vote and select parliamentary representatives, which is really interesting that they're aware of it, and it's written in a negative way that there's 2 women controlling seats in Dublin. But 2 questions really: are the women aware that this is, or do you find any evidence that this is unusual? And secondly, I think you sort of hinted at it as well, is this different from in England? I mean, are the women in Ireland given more, because maybe it's a small political community, a little bit more influence and control?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So are the women aware that they have, that they have that power, which maybe they don't have in England, or their cousins, or even their sisters as wives too? I suppose that some women in England would have had, that there would have been some kind of similar ways that that at least had got, access to votes and things. I mean, there's all sorts of I suppose loopholes, aren't there, in the system that allow for unusual things. But do they kind of? I don't think there is a kind of sense that this is. They seem to very confidently just accept this, and there's so many of them, that that do. I mean, it's interesting. Judith Lewis, who really, I think, she did brilliant work on this, where she included, looked at Irish women as well as English women. I don't think she ever noted that there was a particular sense that of the differences, even though of course there were, and differences around access to the Houses of Parliament as well.
She includes 2 or 3 women in that book, isn't she? So that maybe the examples she was.
No, the only one I've seen, I know that it's sometimes mentioned when these families go to London, and when they say, well, this, I know during the Warren Hastings trial that women would say, well, this will be the only chance we'll get to see Edmund Burke speak. So because we're not allowed, the women aren't allowed in the House of Commons here. But it does. I think it might amplify some of the features of the system that give women a lot of power, because it's such an intimate world.
Oh yeah, thanks. I was quite interested in these conversations across party lines that we were talking about with here in Skeffington. I was wondering how she sort of, I guess, where it stems from, whether you think if it's something to do with that kind of like construction of that salon or intellectual community where you're trying to bridge, make certain kinds of discourse civilized and reasonable, and avoiding kind of pedantry and so on, or are we thinking, is it more that it's a sense of a kind of counterpoint to deepening division and those prospects of violence? And I also wondered how distinct do you think it is these women? Where does it come from, and is it?
That it's a great question. I think it is connected, as you say, to that, the ideal of politeness, typically associated with the salon or mixed sex spaces, and I think, I suppose that one of the big influences, of course, on 18th century you know, Ulster Presbyterians, Belfast Presbyterians, is they are, you know, because so many are educated in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the Scottish Enlightenment is a significant influence. And I think, you know, and that would percolate into, you know, figures like Mark McTeer would also be absorbing those ideas about this is what, you know, civilized society needs, this kind of civil interaction, and this is fundamental to progress. And so many of the, you know, the Irish radicals, that's really what they, you know, that's one of their key kind of touchstones as well, this sense of you know, progress requires enlightened conversation. Yeah, so I think she is perhaps tapping into some of that and trying to protect those kind of spaces where, you know, those interactions were able to happen, like the assembly rooms. But then, yeah, I think by 1796, it's really just the terror of kind of seeing what seems inevitable, which is that it's going to, you know, it is going to reach a very violent climax, and trying to do something to stem that.
James.
It's actually one of the larger mentioned sort of her husband, son-in-law. So you also alluded to her son, the future Omar. Is there any perceived sort of political influence over her son? Obviously, he achieves, you know, firstly for his military career and then big politics. Does that extend him as well, or is that less achieved here?
Well, I think, yeah, so they're clearly collaborating. Lady Moira collects these testimonies from the tenantry on the Moira estate in 1797, and she sends those to Lord Moira, and then he makes a quite famous speech because he has a seat in the English House of Lords, condemning, you know, the basically British policy towards Ireland. So yeah, I think that they're definitely working together, and she gets, you know, she sees, probably not incorrectly, that there is a conspiracy against Lord Moira, because they start arresting suspected United Irishmen amongst his servants and kind of people working at Matas. So she does, I mean, this is very much, yeah, this is about protecting the dynasty, you know, the family business. So she really motors into action to try and defend her son when he starts coming under attack. Yeah.
Patrick.
Thank you. Great. I was going to ask you about religious issues. That's a little bit. One bit, I think there's something interesting there in terms of the way your creeds and groups are popping off that. If your Catholic counter-religious is very interesting there. The other question that struck me, looking at states, all of your case studies, each of them is generations. Each of them is in their sort of 40s and 50s. I never thought about it here. This really struck me as one in her 50s and 1790s. But Robert Shaw is similar.
Yeah.
Shaw's wife is presumably the similar age. Lady Moira's salon. They're like, so is there something about the generation of women in their sort of middle age and their sort of radicalism and interests? And then what is there a younger women's generation in the 1790s who perhaps also have less direct experience with France and so forth, or more mediums, depending where you draw that line? Is there something about different women's generations here?
No, that's a great observation. Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and I hadn't thought about that much, but I was trying to. Yeah, when I started, I think at that moment when I was doing the book, and was having to give the age range for everybody for, you know, the first time. And then, I mean, I should have been thinking about this more carefully before, but you do start to wonder, oh, are there patterns, or what would be the moment of political consciousness? You know, is it the American War, or what's kind of what, you know, I mean, I think for a lot of them it would have been the Patriot campaigns coming at an important time. But absolutely, I think the most interesting comparison would probably be McTeer and Mary Ann McCracken, who is about, you know, Mary Ann McCracken's only in her 20s, you know, so she's about 30 years younger than McTeer, and that really does give her quite a different, I think, relationship to the revolutionary moment. She really is kind of has this sense of utopian optimism, I suppose, about what might be possible in relation to women's rights, you know, what might, you know, maybe it's going to be reserved to Ireland to strike out something new, you know, and all these things where McTeer would have been more cautious. She would have, her republicanism was an older, you know, much more kind of 18th century civic humanist, you know, she says, this is, my republicanism wasn't about killing kings, you know, it was about values. And so yeah, you can really see it there. And then I think there's other elite women, someone like Lucy Fitzgerald, for instance. The really tricky thing is that she's very exposed because she's unmarried. And her family all kind of point this out, you know, you've got to step away from this revolutionary politics because you don't have a husband and you're going to be completely exposed to the gossiping circles of the world. Whereas I think someone like Lady Moira, at her age, she's like, I don't care, you know, I'm just, you know, she has this, I suppose, the confidence that comes from being a sort of established matriarch. Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Yeah.
That's really interesting and so needed. I was just curious on 2 points. I was, of course, Mariah Edgeworth. It's great to hear her, and I wasn't sure because I haven't read your book. I'm sorry. Sometime soon. I was wondering if you feature her because, in my own experience, having worked with her letters, those in, you know, like in England and those kind of split by time. There's a lot of stuff in them, especially with her father's, you know, Richard's sort of early positionality and sort of participation early and soft after a while. You know, there's a lot of sort of stuff in there, especially with her upbringing and the ethos of that, you know, where she talks a lot about, I mean, I think she's very, even though she's, you know, we might think of her as over here like novelist, she's really also writing all those tracts with her father, those pamphlets that are really, we might, you know, they're definitely political, they're definitely, you know, even though it's supposed to be centered around children, I think that they were sort of the right, even though she was sort of forced into writing some of them. So I was wondering first if did she fit into your book, because I think she's younger as well, early on. And then also someone I know it's a little later, you know, 8 to 10 years later, but not unrelated, someone like Anne Devlin, who to me is a Republican. You know, she works with Robert Emmet. She then is tortured. She's held for a while. She's, you know, his housekeeper, possibly his lover. We really don't know. I mean, there's a lot of obviously drama around her, Glasnevin, the grave, you know, all that sort of stuff. But even if you pull aside that kind of thing, she seems like someone who crosses over really well. And I feel like for me, Emmet and Wolfe Tone, I mean, there's obviously something, there's a lot that happens between that time, but it's still part of the same search. And I think it's not unrelated versus what happens 10, 15 years later after the activities.
Yeah, you know, really good questions. Yeah, so Edgeworth does feature, she's a bit more, she's not a central figure. I think partly I just couldn't, I just wouldn't have had the time to really do justice to the full Edgeworth down papers and everything. So she kind of pops up quite a bit. And actually, I mean, you're absolutely right. So one of the arguments I'm making in relation to McTeer, who draws on the Edgeworths, the pedagogical works, which are also, as you're saying, yes, political work. They do have a kind of an intellectual rationale, and they are about, it's this group of women that includes Edgeworth, Elizabeth Hamilton, Anna Barbow, you might be able to kind of put in there as well, various other Unitarian women. There's this network that is, I think, particularly informed by the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher Dougal Stewart. And that is how they're kind of thinking, how do we get beyond this? How do we maintain the Enlightenment or enlightened progress without conflict without, and they're doing that through educational and philanthropic work. So I think, yeah, that's probably where she figures most as part of that kind of very loose network. Yes, yeah, no, I felt I just couldn't do them justice, like, but and Anne Devlin, yeah, also crops up. It was different, obviously she does have this kind of autobiography that she editates. So I use some of that to talk about, in the bit I didn't have time to talk about this evening. But yeah, I think I've struggled to think about how to, it's just very hard, and that's one of the few voices we have from that group. But it was tricky maybe to figure out how to approach it.
They work together.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Anything online, Becca?
Yes, yeah, I've got a question for Catriona. It says, would it be possible to expand on the political visibility of Irish women without property during the period, how that shaped their marginalisation, and what alternative modes of influence or agency there's?
So think about women of no property, is it? Yes, yeah. So I think the tricky thing with this group, I think they're quite, excluded from what are seen as the pathways to politicisation for the men of no property. So there's been quite a lot of work on the men of no property, and sort of radical artisans who are organising in this period. But often those kind of groups were quite hostile to women, or could be, have quite a, belligerent masculine ethos. Similarly, women aren't really involved in the Catholic Convention, which is another important pathway to politicisation. The Defenders, Unite Ourselves. So all these places where I suppose a revolutionary consciousness could be generated in the terms of the French Revolution aren't there. But I suppose one of the arguments I'm making is actually, I think there is a revolutionary consciousness for those women during the rebellion that's been incubated in the inequalities of the household. And so one of the things I'm interested in, part because it's, I'm pursuing it in my current book project, is the mistress-servant relationship. And during the 1798 rebellion, so often there are records of the Catholic servants turning on their Protestant mistresses and saying, we are the masters now and you are the servant, and then also appropriating their clothing. And I think it's not an idea of revolution that's about aristocrats and democrats, so the French Revolution necessarily, but it's I suppose a much more material sense of it. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but thank you.
Yes, come on.
Do you have any insight into the range of reactions to the this with research?
What are women's reactions? Yeah, no, it's a great question. There is, so the Act of Union, through the debates, it is repeatedly claimed that women as a group are much more hostile to the union, and that does, there is some evidence that that is true, and I suggest it may be partly to do with the way the union is figured in the debates as this unhappy marriage, and William Drennan actually says that. He says, there's the marriage analogy seems to have encouraged women to be quite firmly opposed to the union, because they can see, they feel it particularly keenly, this idea of being forced into a relationship on unequal terms. So some of them are there, but as with anything, there are also those who, for various reasons, either think getting rid of the corrupt Irish Parliament is a wonderful thing, or Lady Moira, though, she is firmly opposed, because as she sees it, she is being robbed of her property in and the boroughs that she, you know, would have had influence over because of the Union. Yeah.
Could I ask, Catriona, you touched on Orr as the kind of rival United Irish martyr, and obviously there's no end of martyrs in the end, but in terms of the kind of popular culture, the public history, forgetful remembrance, this guy Biner calls it, of 1798 in the North, I think by far the most eminent, preeminent figure is a woman, Betsy Gray, a woman of nobility. And obviously a lot of that is due to W.G. Little and his kind of popular retellings of that story in the second half of the 19th century. But there are older traditions going back, which you know, identify her as a woman in a significant place at a significant time, engaged in this in this revolution. So I'm wondering, how have you looked at where that tradition comes from, and at what point that enters into public consciousness, this kind of woman as martyr?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So actually the final bookends, I do think about memory and commemoration, and I suppose how we get from some of the women that I'm interested in to the you know, the kind of celebration of the Sarah Currans, and you know, all these that are perhaps you know, adhere more to a certain type of woman of 98, but I think the earliest account of Betsy Gray comes from Mary Ann McCracken. And so I think it's really interesting that it's women who seem to be particularly keen to record and archive that tradition. And then Mary Balfour, the Balfour poet, she writes a poem about her. So yeah, so they're kind of, I think there is a tendency with some of these unofficial forms of memory that are the preserve of women, that they are more attuned to women's action in the rebellion and are more likely to remember that. And then I have thought about, why does she go on to be the figure of the 1798 rebellion in Ulster memory? And I think, again, that's something I would speculate that has something to do with her being a woman who is, her femininity allows her to be as perhaps a less political figure. And I don't know if that kind of makes sense. That I think that I just, yeah, that may kind of explain that why she becomes popular in a way that I think named United Irishmen would have been more problematic in the 19th century to kind of commemorate in the same way.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions online or in the room? Yes, sure.
I still think that's about my head, was I'm delighted. A lot of recrimination after the rebellion. Self-one alter, Latin is vilified. What about Lady Mora? Is there any sort of negative impact against her very public position?
Yeah, from the
counter-revolution,
is there any kickback? I think no, I don't think there is, but she starts to she does write in her letters in 1790. She says, I'm just going to be careful about what I say because I don't want to be thought to doubt by Lees and co. So she's talking about John Lees, who's the head of the post office. So yeah, she probably did have a feeling that people were keeping an eye on her. I haven't come across anything more substantial about, I think they probably, openly attacking a woman of her years might have seemed a bit over the top, and also because she is, she does have such a kind of distinguished status, so she may have been difficult to touch,
Okay, so I think we've been given a real sense this afternoon of how important this book is, Women, Politics and the Irish Public Sphere in the Age of Revolution. It's published by Oxford, is that right? At an unreasonably high price. So do order it for the libraries, do put it on your reading lists. Let's try and push Oxford into getting a paperback edition out. It's a really important and groundbreaking work. Thank you so much, Catriona, for coming. Just before everybody goes, reminder, we do have a seminar next Monday. So we've got 3 speakers, Emily Mark Fitzgerald from UCD Art History, Emma Radley from UCD Film Studies, and Kathy Kearney from our now welcome into the Queen's Embrace, Dundalk Institute of Technology, dance studies. So they produced a special issue of Irish University Review earlier this year on Irish Studies Beyond the Text. So this is going to be a kind of collaborative panel on looking at Irish studies in these kind of visual cultures and performance cultures as well. So hopefully people can come along to that. That'll be 4:30 in this room next Monday.
That's great.